October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, a day of fasting, reflection and prayer. In Israel, the entire country seemed to pause. Shops were shuttered, radios silent, and even the roads were deserted. Israel was silent, streets empty, the nation deep in prayer. Families gathered in synagogues seeking peace and forgiveness, unaware that history was about to change in a single shattering moment. Suddenly, sirens shattered the peace. The wail echoed through the stillness, jolting people from their prayers. Across the Suez Canal, Egyptian artillery unleashed a massive barrage, sending shockwaves through the Israeli defenses. The Yom Kippur War had begun. Israel was caught completely off guard. Soldiers scrambled from their posts, commanders struggled to understand the scale of the attack, and confusion reigned in the first chaotic hours. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's plan, years in the making, aimed to reclaim the Sinai and restore Egypt's pride. He had carefully coordinated with Syria, determined to strike when Israel least expected it. Israeli intelligence, lulled by routine Egyptian exercises, dismissed the threat, fatally. Reports of unusual activity were brushed aside as leaders clung to the belief that war was unlikely. The Concepcia held that Egypt wouldn't attack without air superiority. It was a disastrous miscalculation. Israeli jets sat idle, and the military's guard was down at the worst possible moment. Israeli soldiers along the Suez, observing the holy day, were overwhelmed as Egyptian warplanes struck deep into Sinai. The Bar-Lev line, once thought impregnable, was breached within hours. Simultaneously, Syria attacked the Golan Heights. Israeli outposts in the north were bombarded, and tanks rolled across the border. Israel faced war on two fronts, unprepared and in shock. The myth of Israeli invincibility, forged in 1967, was shattered in hours. The confidence of a nation, built on past victories, crumbled as the reality of defeat loomed. Prime Minister Golda Meir and her generals scrambled to mobilize reserves, racing against time as desperate reports flooded in. Every minute counted as the scale of the disaster became clear. The nation's confidence evaporated, replaced by the terrifying realization Israel was fighting for survival, blindsided by a war it never saw coming. Families huddled in bomb shelters, listening for news, fearing the worst. The fate of the country hung in the balance. In those first desperate hours, no one knew if Israel would survive the storm that had broken over its borders. Egypt's Operation Badr was a masterclass in military innovation. The Suez Canal and the Bar-Lev line, Israel's impenetrable sand ramparts, were breached not with explosives, but with water cannons. Egyptian commandos crossed in rubber boats, engineers blasted gaps in the sand walls, and 80,000 troops surged across pontoon bridges. The Israeli defenders, thinly spread and stunned, were quickly overwhelmed. Egypt's new Soviet-supplied Sagar missiles destroyed Israeli tanks from afar, while SAMs created a deadly no-fly zone for Israeli jets. In hours, Egypt had crossed the canal, built a formidable bridgehead, and changed the rules of modern warfare. The Bar-Lev line, once a symbol of security, was now a muddy ruin. Israel's command reeled, facing a crisis unlike any before. The Egyptians were ready for the inevitable counterattack. For Israeli soldiers in the Bar-Lev line, the invasion was a nightmare. Isolated and surrounded, they fought desperately as Egyptian forces bypassed strong points and pushed deeper into Sinai. Israeli tanks rushed to the front, only to be ambushed by hidden Egyptian infantry wielding Sagar missiles. The desert became a graveyard of burning Israeli armor. The new missiles shattered Israeli confidence, on the ground and in the air. The Israeli Air Force, once dominant, now faced a deadly SAM shield. Counterattacks failed, losses mounted, and panic spread in Tel Aviv. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, shaken, warned of disaster. The myth of invincibility was gone. Israel's leadership faced the consequences of their misjudgment. The Bar-Lev line had fallen, and the Egyptian army surged forward. The path into Sinai lay open. After their stunning success in crossing the Suez Canal, Egyptian forces paused to consolidate their hard-won gains on the eastern bank. The initial shock of their attack had caught Israel off guard, and for a brief moment, the momentum was entirely with Egypt. Soldiers dug in, fortifying positions and preparing for what they hoped would be a decisive campaign. The mood among the troops was one of cautious optimism, as they awaited further orders. President Anwar Sadat had achieved a major political and psychological victory, restoring Egyptian pride and shattering Israel's aura of invincibility. Across Egypt, celebrations erupted as news of the crossing spread, and Sadat's bold gamble seemed to be paying off. Yet, within the Egyptian high command, debate raged. Sadat's generals hesitated to push further, deeply concerned about advancing beyond the protective umbrella of their surface-to-air missile shield. The SAM batteries had been crucial in blunting Israeli air power, and moving too far could expose their forces to devastating airstrikes. This pause, while necessary for regrouping, gave Israel precious time to mobilize its reserves and reorganize its battered defenses. Israeli commanders quickly called up thousands of reservists, determined to turn the tide. On October 14, under mounting pressure to relieve Syrian forces in the north, Sadat ordered a risky offensive deeper into the Sinai desert. The decision was controversial, but Sadat believed a bold move was needed to maintain momentum and support his Syrian allies. Over 1,000 Egyptian tanks surged forward, advancing beyond the range of their SAM protection. The vast armored columns kicked up clouds of dust as they pressed into open desert, now vulnerable to Israeli air attacks. Israel, now fully prepared and reinforced, met the Egyptian advance with devastating force. Israeli tank crews and infantry had spent days preparing defensive positions, waiting for just such an opportunity. The Israeli Air Force struck the exposed Egyptian tanks relentlessly, while Israeli ground forces outmaneuvered and outflanked the advancing armor. The desert became a deadly trap for the Egyptians. By day's end, Egypt had lost over 250 tanks, with many more damaged or abandoned. Israeli losses were minimal in comparison, and the scale of the defeat stunned the Egyptian command. The Egyptian offensive collapsed in chaos, and their hard-won momentum evaporated almost overnight. The sense of triumph was replaced by confusion and retreat. With the Egyptian forces in disarray, the strategic initiative shifted decisively to Israel. Israeli commanders seized the opportunity to plan a bold counterattack. The war's tide had turned. The world watched as Israel prepared to launch its own offensive, determined to regain the upper hand in the Sinai. Now, with their forces massed and morale restored, Israel was ready to strike back and change the course of the conflict once again. With Egypt's offensive shattered, Israel launched Operation Abarei Lev, Knights of the Heart. Major General Ariel Sharon targeted a weak point between Egyptian armies near the Great Bitter Lake. The plan crossed the Suez, strike deep into Egypt, and destroy SAM sites. On October 15, Sharon's forces crossed at Deversoir, establishing a precarious foothold on the West Bank. Paratroopers and tanks operated behind enemy lines, attacking SAM batteries and sowing chaos. Engineers raced to build a pontoon bridge under relentless fire. The operation was a gamble. If it failed, Israel risked disaster. But boldness paid off. The bridgehead held, and Israeli armor began pouring across. The fate of the war now hinged on this narrow corridor. The most decisive battle was about to begin. To secure the crossing, Israeli forces had to capture the Chinese Farm, a heavily defended Egyptian stronghold. The battle was brutal. Tanks, paratroopers, and infantry clashed at point-blank range for 3 days. Israeli and Egyptian soldiers fought with extraordinary courage and desperation. The landscape became a hell of burning armor and relentless gunfire. Israeli paratroopers, led by Danny Matt, suffered heavy casualties clearing irrigation ditches and roads. Medics risked their lives to save the wounded. Many soldiers refused evacuation, fighting to the end. The Chinese Farm became a symbol of sacrifice and survival. Ultimately, Israeli forces secured the corridor, allowing the bridge to be completed. The cost was immense, but the way was open for Israeli armor to cross into Egypt. The battle broke the Egyptian defense and turned the tide in Sinai. With the bridgehead secure, Israeli forces surged across the west bank of the Suez Canal, systematically destroying Egyptian SAM sites and regaining crucial air supremacy. The momentum had shifted dramatically, and the Israeli military pressed its advantage, pushing deeper into Egyptian territory with determination and speed. The tables had turned. Egyptian forces, once the attackers, now found themselves trapped and exposed on the east bank. Cut off from reinforcements and supplies, many Egyptian soldiers faced the grim reality of surrender or destruction. Israeli armored columns moved swiftly, encircling the Egyptian Third Army. Supply lines were severed, and the threat to both Suez and even Cairo itself became all too real. The fate of tens of thousands of Egyptian troops now hung in the balance. The war, which had begun with a stunning Egyptian triumph, now teetered on the edge of total Egyptian disaster. The cost in lives and equipment was mounting by the hour, and the psychological toll was immense. Alarmed by the possibility of a wider conflict, the superpowers intervened. The United States and the Soviet Union, wary of direct confrontation, pressured both sides to halt the fighting, fearing the war could spiral into a global crisis. The United Nations called for a ceasefire on October 22. Though sporadic fighting continued for days, the war was effectively over. Exhaustion and devastation lingered on both sides of the canal. Israel now stood near the gates of Cairo, victorious but deeply scarred. Over 2,600 Israeli soldiers had lost their lives. Thousands more were wounded, and the nation's sense of security was shaken to its core. the cost of victory was painfully high. For Egypt, the war restored a sense of national pride. Despite their army being surrounded, Egyptians celebrated the initial crossing of the canal and the proof that Israel was not invincible. The psychological impact resonated across the Arab world. The conflict forced both nations to confront a harsh truth. Endless war would only bring more suffering. The heavy losses and devastation made it clear that a new path was needed. The Yom Kippur War became the catalyst for peace, setting the stage for the Camp David Accords and a historic treaty between Egypt and Israel. For the first time, former enemies sat down to negotiate a future without war. The cost was staggering: thousands dead, families shattered, and entire communities changed forever. Yet, from the ashes of conflict, the path to peace had finally begun to emerge. The war's legacy was one of tragedy and transformation, but also of hope. It showed that even the deepest wounds could lead to new beginnings and the possibility of a different future. The world would never be the same. The lessons of the Yom Kippur War continue to echo, reminding us of the high price of conflict and the enduring value of peace.